Xin kính chào quý vị, chào mừng quý vị đến với Diễn đàn CEO trên kênh truyền hình VTV. Thưa quý vị, sau hơn 20 năm kể từ khi chính phủ thực hiện đường lối đổi mới kinh tế vào năm 1986, Việt Nam đã trở thành một trong những nền kinh tế phát triển nhanh nhất châu Á. Trong báo cáo về tình hình kinh tế xã hội gần đây, Ủy ban Giám sát Tài chính Quốc gia đưa ra những nhận định rất tích cực về sự chuyển biến của thị trường chứng khoán thời gian tới, với chỉ số VN Index tăng, thanh khoản thị trường tốt hơn. Việc ra đời các quỹ mở vào thời điểm này được xem như sự đón đầu những tín hiệu khả quan từ nền kinh tế. Đón đầu xu hướng đó thì vào cuối tháng 10 năm 2013, Quỹ đầu tư cân bằng chiến lược VCBF được giới thiệu như một trường hợp điển hình của dạng quỹ mở cân bằng đầu tiên tại Việt Nam. Triển vọng cũng như thách thức của hình thức đầu tư vào các quỹ này là như thế nào? Đây cũng là chủ đề mà Diễn đàn CEO đề cập trong chương trình tuần này. Nhưng trước khi gặp gỡ vị CEO của VCBF, mời quý vị cùng theo dõi phóng sự sau.
Sau hơn 20 năm kể từ khi chính phủ thực hiện đường lối đổi mới kinh tế năm 1986, Việt Nam đã trở thành một trong những nền kinh tế phát triển nhanh nhất châu Á, với mức tăng trưởng GDP thực tế hàng năm trung bình là 7,0% trong giai đoạn 2002-2012. Bình quân GDP đầu người theo giá hiện hành cũng tăng nhanh và ổn định hơn trong 2 thập kỷ qua, tăng từ 140 đô la Mỹ năm 1992 lên 1.749 đô la Mỹ năm 2012 và 1.890 đô la Mỹ năm 2013. Một chính phủ với chế độ chính trị ổn định vẫn tiếp tục thúc đẩy cải cách và tái cơ cấu nền kinh tế nhằm bình ổn kinh tế vĩ mô và tăng cường mở rộng kinh tế trong cả nước. Một quốc gia đa tôn giáo và thuần nhất về sắc tộc. Một đất nước với nguồn tài nguyên thiên nhiên phong phú như dầu mỏ, khoáng sản và các mặt hàng nông sản. Một quốc gia với dân số khá lớn, 90 triệu người với tỷ lệ dân số trẻ trong độ tuổi từ 15 đến 65 tuổi chiếm 67%. Việt Nam đã bước vào giai đoạn cơ cấu dân số vàng với số người trong độ tuổi lao động gấp đôi số người ngoài độ tuổi lao động. Một lực lượng lao động rất năng động và có kỹ năng tốt, chi phí lao động và chi phí hoạt động của doanh nghiệp thấp nhất thế giới. Việt Nam là một trong những điểm đến hấp dẫn nhất đối với đầu tư trực tiếp nước ngoài FDI. Mặc dù bị tác động bởi các vấn đề kinh tế vĩ mô trong 2 năm qua, Việt Nam vẫn đứng thứ 11 trên thế giới và thứ 3 trong khu vực. Trong xu hướng đó, sự ra đời của Quỹ đầu tư cân bằng chiến lược VCBF là một tín hiệu tích cực cho thị trường vốn Việt Nam. Quỹ đầu tư cân bằng chiến lược VCBF là quỹ mở vừa đầu tư vào trái phiếu 50% và cổ phiếu 50%. Quỹ đầu tư cân bằng chiến lược VCBF giúp mọi người tham gia đầu tư chứng khoán, tăng trưởng vốn khi thời gian và thông tin về thị trường của họ có giới hạn. Ngân hàng Vietcombank nắm giữ 51% vốn tại VCBF và hiện được đánh giá là ngân hàng cao cấp hàng đầu tại Việt Nam nhờ vào năng lực và vai trò chủ chốt trong ngành ngân hàng Việt Nam. Đây là ngân hàng lớn thứ tư xét về tổng tài sản và là ngân hàng có lợi nhuận lớn thứ 3 trong nhóm dịch vụ tài chính và ngân hàng tại Việt Nam. Franklin Templeton Investment nắm giữ 49% vốn tại VCBF và là một trong những tập đoàn quản lý tài sản lớn nhất toàn cầu, trụ sở chính đặt tại California, Mỹ. Tập đoàn hiện có văn phòng tại 35 quốc gia và các khách hàng ở 150 nước. Tập đoàn Franklin Templeton Investment với hơn 65 năm kinh nghiệm và có lịch sử đầu tư lâu dài tại các thị trường mới nổi. Franklin Templeton Investment là một trong những tập đoàn quản lý đầu tư đầu tiên phát triển khắp toàn cầu. Trong số 110 quỹ mà Franklin Templeton Investment đang quản lý, có 22 quỹ được Morningstar xếp hạng 4 sao và 12 quỹ được xếp hạng 5 sao tính đến tháng 11 năm 2013. Morningstar là một tổ chức độc lập của Mỹ chuyên xếp hạng các quỹ.
So please join us to welcome Mr. Avinash Sakwalekha, the Chief Executive Officer and Chief Investment Officer of Vietcombank Funds Management here in our program today. Thank you for spending your time with us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on the show.
So Avinash, I've known that VCBF is a joint venture between Vietcombank and Franklin Templeton Investment. We have just launched the VCBF Tactical Balanced Funds recently. Open-ended fund is a new form of investment in Vietnam. So as the CEO and CIO of VCBF, could you share more? What is an open-ended fund?
Open-ended funds are a form of mutual fund. It's an asset class where investors pool money together and then invest it in different investments. So the advantage of having an open-ended fund is transparency, it's regulated, it has professional managers that run it, and there's a tremendous amount of scale in the system as well.
So why is the fund called open?
Open as a concept or as a term means that there is no end to the life of the fund, and that's the reason it is called open. This is different from a closed-end fund, which has a very finite or a definite time period for the fund.
So who should invest in open-ended funds and what types are there?
Open-ended funds are open for anyone to invest in. These are basically instruments that are used for savings, and anyone that wants to save for the long term should be investing in open-ended funds. Now, there are many advantages of open-ended funds. They're professionally managed, and what I mean by that is we have teams of both portfolio managers and research analysts that are looking at companies and investments. Secondly, it provides the investors with diversification. So when you're looking at different assets that you can invest in, you very easily have the ability to invest in, let's say, 10 different companies, including fixed income instruments, which as an individual you may not have been able to do directly yourself. And then lastly, I'd say there's a tremendous amount of transparency. So given that it is an open-ended fund and it is very well regulated and reported on a monthly basis to the State Securities Commission. Now, in terms of the types of open-ended funds that are available, currently there's a fixed income fund product. There's also an equity fund product out there in the market. Our fund, which is VCBF Tactical Balanced Fund, is the first fund where we're doing both fixed income as well as equity. And the way we're doing that is we're balancing the investments in the two different asset classes.
So with your experiences in working and managing the open-ended funds in other countries, so please share with us more information about them.
Sure. As I said, open-ended funds is not a new concept. In the US, it started back in 1924. But even in Asia, it has been a relatively well-known concept. For example, in Korea, it started in 1970, open-ended funds. In Thailand, it was started in 1977. In China, for example, it was started in 1991. Now, China is an interesting example because after having started in 1991, by 2011, the fund industry in China was about 6% of GDP. Now, when you compare that to some of the other Asian countries, India, for example, the mutual fund industry is about 7% of GDP. If you look at some of the smaller countries, like let's say the Philippines or Indonesia, where that market has not opened up as yet, the mutual fund industry is about 2.5% of GDP. So in terms of an opportunity in Vietnam, even if we were to say that Vietnam expands its mutual fund industry to, let's say, 2.5% of GDP, that would take the size of the mutual fund industry to about $5 billion, which is a pretty significant size in a short amount of time. Now, in terms of why we saw these different markets have accelerating or larger mutual fund assets, the reason is you had this trend that moved towards privatization of pension plans, as well as tax incentives that were provided to the mutual fund industry and to the investors directly. So in Vietnam, we are starting to see that. We are starting to see privatization of pension plans, and that's one of the next big reforms that is going to take place in Vietnam.
So what support has VCBF received from the Franklin Templeton Investments?
Franklin Templeton Investments, as I mentioned earlier, given that it is a global company and given that it has had such a long history of not only investing, but also of growing and launching products in different countries. So Franklin Templeton has a very long-term view, and whenever they've gotten into a market, it's been for the long term. So for Vietnam in particular, Franklin Templeton came into this joint venture in 2008. So it's already been 5 years, and given the focus on the long term and given the opportunity available in Vietnam, they're very committed to staying here for the long term. Now, the support that VCBF receives is on multiple levels. Number one, we get access to all this global experience that we were talking about. So Franklin has invested in or opened up offices in Malaysia, in India, and that level of experience helps us when we're looking to do something new. So for example, when we were looking to help launch the open-ended funds, it was very easy for us to tap into the resources that Franklin has. And that helped us in being able to provide feedback to the State Securities Commission when they were looking at forming the regulations for the open-ended funds as well. Now, on the research level, as I mentioned, Franklin has over 550 investment professionals around the world. Our investment professionals have the ability to tap into all that research. So our analysts, our portfolio managers go across to the different Franklin Templeton offices and sit down and meet with the research analysts over there, share ideas, methodologies, discuss sectors, and that kind of interaction is extremely valuable for our investors. Finally, on the operations side, Franklin Templeton has, as you can imagine, global standards when it comes to anything related to the open-ended funds. So VCBF has been able to leverage that and implement standards that are much higher than necessary because we think those are good for the investors in Vietnam.
So could you tell us more about the VCBF Tactical Balanced Funds investment strategy?
Sure. As the name suggests, Tactical Balanced Fund, the strategy of the fund itself is to balance the investments between fixed income securities and equity securities. And the idea being that you want to be able to invest in both asset classes because both asset classes are going to be attractive at different points in time. So to give you a sense for it, the benchmark for the fund is the average return of the VN index and the 10-year government bond. So for equities, we would be tracking the VN index as the benchmark. And in that case, we're investing in companies, typically large cap companies that fit what we're looking for in terms of our investment criteria. And then for fixed income, we would be tracking the 10-year government bond. So in that case, we would be investing in either government bonds or municipal bonds or even corporate bonds, depending on the attractiveness of the different investment opportunities. Now, the key thing to remember is the tactical part of it in the name. So when we say tactical balanced fund, the tactical part is very important to understand what that means because that is where we decide how to allocate between the two different asset classes. So if you look at the benchmark, we're looking at, let's say, 50% each in either equities or in fixed income. But that's not necessarily how the portfolio will be structured. Depending on how we think the economy is functioning or what the macro conditions are or what kind of attractive opportunities we're getting in equities, we will shift the percentage allocation. So for example, currently, we think that the equity market has a lot more opportunities available compared to the fixed income market. So the percentage allocation to the equity markets will be much higher than the 50%. Now, as a rule, we have set it up in the fund that no more, for any one asset class, no more than 75% of the fund would be invested.
So what are the differences between VCBF Tactical Balanced Funds compared to other kind of funds in Vietnam?
Currently, as I mentioned earlier, currently there are fixed income funds and equity funds. But VCBF's Tactical Balanced Fund is the first fund that does both. And that's the difference. That's the biggest difference is that in one fund you have the ability to invest in both fixed income as well as in equities. And the important thing, as I mentioned earlier also, was the tactical balance part of it. When you tactically balance a fund, you're dynamically changing the asset allocation between the two securities. And that is what's different.
Some experts said it is a good time too to invest in Vietnam's stock market. What do you think?
I tend to agree with that. I think Vietnam has a number of attractive long-term trends. I think the population, given that it is very young, and growing. As that population grows, it will invest, it will consume. Now, on the macro level, over the last few years, we've seen a tremendous amount of improvement in Vietnam itself. If you look at GDP growth rate, it has stabilized right now just around a little more than 5.5%. And that is going to accelerate over the next couple of years, is what our assumption is. What we've also seen is that the exchange rate in Vietnam has been incredibly stable for the last couple of years. And that is extremely important to remember, because when you compare that to a lot of the other Asian currencies in the globe or in the region, that has not been the case. So Vietnam stands out in terms of having this stable exchange rate. Also, interest rates in the last few years have come down dramatically. Now, this is important because that provides a tremendous amount of stimulus for companies to start investing. It also makes it a lot easier to borrow and a lot more affordable to borrow, both for the companies as well as for individuals that are trying to borrow to either buy a house or to buy a motorbike or buy any other consumer goods. So I think on a macro level, there's a tremendous amount of upliftment and there's a tremendous amount of good policies. Now, speaking of policies,